Yet, everyone. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and especially to be sharing about today's topic. I'm so excited. We have two major settlements before the nation's leadership. We have our New Mexico settlement that will close out two substantial claims in the Rio San Jose stream system, as well as the Rio Puerco Basin. That's going to go a long ways to getting our people real access to water in our Eastern Navajo communities. And then today we're talking about the Northeastern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement Agreement. And that is going to be a comprehensive settlement of the nation's water rights in the state of Arizona. And as someone who grew up without running water, and my mother still doesn't have running water, and coming from a ranching and grazing family, having meaningful access to water is so, so important. It has so many different impacts on the health outcomes of our children, their ability to fulfill their full potential, and to, of course, enrich and contribute to our community as a result of that. And it's a basic human right. Everybody has access to water. In the United States, outside of Indian country, it's time for that access to be made available to this nation's first peoples, this nation's first sovereigns. And of course, the nation is a substantial part of the body of Indigenous sovereigns in this country. And it's honestly just a shame that we've had to wait so long and had to endure such extreme water starvation. And so it's so wonderful to be at this moment where we have a negotiated settlement that our leadership will be able to consider as we move forward. And just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, She'e Ethelbranchian She, Bipatwani Nishle, Nakai Bashachin, Sitnajeni Deshache, Ado Nakai Dashanella, Kinthana Kehashte, East Canyon Diablo Detnasha, Loop Chapter A, She Chapter, and She'e Deneba Washington, Biagati Taitso, Shinanish. It's an honor to be the nation's 13th Attorney General. It's an honor to serve as part of the Nigerian administration and with this 25th Navajo Nation Council, just such a wonderful group of leaders and who are really focused on the things that matter to the Navajo people. And so I'm just so pleased that we're at this point. Leadership was very actively involved in negotiating the settlement. And so it's exciting that they're going to see the fruits of their labor here in the near term. So I'm going to walk you through my presentation. And before I do that, I do want to just be very clear that we are a water settlement is part of a process. And so we are very much in that process at this moment, but we're really at the first phase of the process. So getting the negotiated settlement with the other parties is the first phase. So now we're ready to present that to Congress, and Congress's approval is really the second phase. And then once Congress approves this, and to say that these are like singular phases is really kind of funny to me, because just to get through phase one has been really huge, and we're still not at the end. We're not going to be at the end of phase one until all of the parties approve the settlement. So what's happened so far is their attorneys have negotiated the settlement, and so now we're at the approval process, the Navajo Nation approval process point, and all of the other parties that are parties to the settlement are also going to be going through their approval process here in the next few weeks. And then also, to simplify the congressional phase as just one thing, there's a lot that has to happen during that phase. There have to be hearings before the House Natural Resources Committee, the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. There's a markup. And then, of course, hopefully the legislation goes up for a vote. But there's a lot of steps within each of these phases and a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes. And some of them, the phases are happening simultaneously. For example, even though we're still in the first phase, we have already deployed folks on the Hill who are talking about the water settlement. In fact, just last week, President Nygren was meeting with Senator Kelly's staff, talking to them about the Arizona water settlement, getting them up to speed. We've had communications about our New Mexico settlement for years now, including on the Hill. So there's a lot of groundwork that has been laid in coordination in this process. So the second phase, of course, after we get through this phase, is the congressional phase, the congressional approvals. And that's where Congress is going to look at what we've negotiated as parties and is going to say, do we agree with this? And that's going to be an opportunity for the other states in the union to weigh in on our settlement. And there are 7 basin states in the Colorado River Basin, including Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. Those are considered upper basin states. And so they're going to have an opportunity to weigh in on this. And of course, our settlement does really touch on some of their interests. It includes some upper basin water. It includes most of Arizona's upper basin allocation. And so we may see, because representatives from other states are going to be part of this process at the congressional level, we may see some boundary setting that is not quite to the full extent of our settlement. For example, one of those key things is the amount of funding. So we have proposed a $5 billion settlement, but Congress may decide, we're only going to give them, we're going to give them more. Let's be optimistic. We're going to give them $7 billion instead. And then at that point, the settling parties would have to go back into the settlement agreement that we've all signed off on and amend it or edit it so that we've now built in that additional $2 billion worth of projects. And then that's called conforming the document to what Congress has authorized. And so that is the third phase. And then the fourth phase, part of the third phase is for all of the parties to, again, look at the document, make sure that that's still acceptable settlement terms for all of us. And then the parties sign it again, that conformed document, the real final settlement document. And so that's really phase 3. And again, we're still just at the tail end of phase 1. And so then once everyone signs that conformed document, then we have to take it back to the court and have the court enter it into a decree so that it's an enforceable document that we can take back to the court and use to exercise our rights that we've negotiated for and that are memorialized, that are written into the document. So that's just, I wanted to give everyone, that view so that you can all be aware that even though this is a tremendous watershed moment, it's really still very early in the process, and we're not even done with phase 1 of a 4-phase process. So with that, I will go ahead and launch into the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so obviously water is very, very important to the Diné people. Since time immemorial, since our creation, water has been foundational to who we are as Diné people. It's really built into our cosmology in a central manner. From the fog and the birth of Changing Woman and how water has played into Navajo creation. It's been extremely important. And so this is just that acknowledgement and that grounding, that sense of the importance of water to Navajo people spiritually has been very central to our negotiations as we move forward, and wanting to be respectful of the water and of the rivers that we're talking about. And so that this is just to remind us of the central place of water and who we are as human beings and as Diné people in particular. So next slide. I mentioned that there are 7 states in the Colorado River Basin, and the basin is divided between an upper basin and a lower basin. And this map kind of helps ground everyone so you can get a sense for all of the different tributary rivers into the system or that are part of the system. And you can see that in Arizona includes portions of the upper basin as well as the lower basin. And the Little Colorado River is a prime contributor to the main stem, as you can see from this picture, flowing northwesterly from the White Mountains of Arizona. Next slide. Okay, and then there's something that people talk to talk about that's called the Law of the River. And we actually have done a Facebook Live on the Department of Justice's webpage, as well as on my Facebook page, where you can access this information. We have a whole presentation on the Law of the River. I think we did that in December. Please tune in if you want to learn more about the Law of the River. But for now, I'll just say a substantial, central component of that is the 1922 Colorado River Basin Compact. And that's where the allocations were made. The water in the river was essentially divvied up among the upper basin and lower basin states. And then within each basin, it was allocated to the states in unique ways. In the upper basin, there was 50,000 acre feet that was taken off the top for Arizona. And that's a fixed number because it related to how much water Arizona needed for Navajo Generating Station, as well as for the city of Page. And so that's why there's that fixed number for Arizona. And then the rest of the states in the upper basin were allocated a percentage of the upper basin water. And the divvying up was really 7.5 million to the upper basin, 7.5 to the lower basin, for a total of 15 million acre feet per year in the entire system. And if you want to know what an acre foot is, it's basically a football field that's filled up with water for 1 foot. It's a lot of water. It's enough water to sustain a small family for 1 year. And so when we're saying 15 million acre feet, you get a sense for the magnitude of that. And then in the lower basin, the way it works is there are fixed allocations among the lower basin states. And as you can see, Arizona is the only state that is in both the upper basin and the lower basin. And of course, most of the upper basin in Arizona is on the Navajo Nation, as you can see from that map there. Next slide, please. This was the information on what an acre foot is. Go ahead and take us to the next one. And then in terms of the Colorado River Compact and the Law of the River that's a part of, the way things work, and we don't like this, nobody likes this, but this is the conditions that we find ourselves negotiating in. Oh, sorry, Kevin, okay. The apportionment is really among the states. The indigenous sovereigns didn't get special allocations. And so each of us get placed in sort of a state-based framework. All of our litigation is done in front of state courts. And so it makes it hard to have a fair outcome, certainly. But these are just the conditions that we find ourselves in. And we're doing the best with that situation to make sure that we actually have water for our people and that we have a future for our people in our homeland. And so we are working certainly with the settlement, negotiating with the other state parties, making sure that there is that as fair as possible, given the starting circumstances, as fair as possible of an outcome for the nation, and that we're maximizing the amount of water that's coming to our people. And of course, there's the quote there that says that the compact has to not affect the obligation of the United States to Indian tribes. If you want to know about the extent of their obligation, just watch our presentation on the Arizona v. Navajo Nation litigation, the Supreme Court decision that came out recently. And so there's not enough consideration and respect for the rights that the original sovereigns of this nation have in this process. But again, we want to make sure we have water for our people. So we're going to move through that process. And there is an adjudication that is happening, and there's going to be a judgment and a decision as to how much of a water claim, enforceable water claim, the nation has in the Colorado River Basin. Well, in particular, with respect to the Little Colorado River, that's the active adjudication happening right now. I think there are some slides that pertain to that, so I'm going to go ahead and have us advance to the next slide. This is a map of the upper basin and lower basin that shows you all of the chapters on the nation. So you can see there the tan and the orange are the upper basin. And again, most of the upper basin in Arizona is Navajo sovereign territory. It's just a small bit, like a little bit to the west of Page, like the Kanab area. It looks like that is part of the upper basin that's not on the nation. And then, of course, we have the extensive lower basin that makes up, that touches on a significant portion of the Navajo Nation. I think it's 44 chapters of the nation are in the Little Colorado River Basin. The Little Colorado River Basin, we call it a basin, but really it's a sub-basin. It is part of the lower basin. So all of the blue and green, that is lower basin. There's only one small portion, like maybe half of Botaway Gap chapter, which you can see kind of to the north westerly portion of the nation along the Colorado River. That portion is blue, and it's only within, it's within the lower basin outside of the Little Colorado River Basin. All of the rest of the nation in the lower basin is in the Little Colorado River Basin. And you can see placement of our four sacred mountains here, of course, and our LCR, Little Colorado River, is one of our four sacred rivers, and it's a protector for us with headwaters, both for it and the Colorado River in our sacred mountains. You can see San Juan River on the north, Colorado River on the west, Rio Grande on the east. So next slide. The San Juan Southern Paiute tribe was brought into our negotiations in February. We settled our land claim with them in 2000. That there was a treaty that council approved, and it has an addendum as well that provides for a northern and a southern reservation for San Juan Southern Paiute tribe. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, has never partitioned that reservation. They've never fenced it. And there's never been sort of a federal acknowledgement of the sovereign boundaries of the San Juan Southern Paiute tribe. And so we were in the process of getting legislation, federal legislation, sponsored by Representative Crane, that would go ahead and essentially acknowledge our treaty agreement and also direct the secretary to partition the reservations for San Juan Southern Paiute. And that was kind of put on pause. Because that was ongoing. And of course, one of the questions that came up in that process was the extent of San Juan Southern Paiute's water rights. And so it just worked out that with our water settlement negotiations moving forward, it was relatively easy to bring them into that broader water settlement. And so that's what we did. And so it'll be sort of a comprehensive water settlement for Northeastern Arizona and all three indigenous sovereigns from the region. And that's why the name of the settlement is the Northeastern Arizona Indian Water Rights Settlement. And so you can see here that San Juan Southern Paiute has a northern reservation around the Navajo Mountain area, and that's in the state of Utah. It also has a southern reservation that is near Echo Cliffs. If you're driving up Highway 89 to Page from Flagstaff, right after you pass the turnoff for Tuba City, you can see Echo Cliffs up. You see like the green area. It's kind of that area there up against the ridge, and the ridge is Echo Cliffs. So that is what is being incorporated into the legislation, and we're addressing the rights of San Juan Southern Paiute as part of this. So when that comes up, we put this here really as a reference slide so that you guys can have a better sense of what we're talking about when we talk about San Juan Southern Paiute later in the presentation. So next slide. Okay, we're going to talk about the general stream adjudication. So basically, there's a question, a legal question right now, an issue, and that is, what is the extent of the Navajo Nation's water rights claim in the state of Arizona? And as I walked you through, there are different basins. There's the LCR basin, there's what remains of the lower basin of the Colorado River in Arizona, And then there's also the upper basin in Arizona. So when water rights are being determined, they have a stream adjudication. And that's where the court says not only, what is one party's extent of rights into the water in the stream, it's asking what is everyone, how much water, how does each of the parties in this basin with rights in this basin, how much water do they have an enforceable right to? And then there'll be a document, a piece of paper that comes out saying this party gets this much water, this other party gets this much water, and on and on. And then there'll be a judgment. The court will issue its judgment, and then everybody will get that judgment, and they'll have that quantified amount right. And if somebody interferes with that, they'll have the ability to enforce it in the courts. And so that's one path. Anytime that there's litigation, there's always the opportunity for settlement. And so the LCR adjudication was filed in 1978, and the nation filed its claim in 1985. So you get a sense for that it takes quite a while for these things to move forward. These are tremendous, tremendous cases, tremendous volume of work and documentation that goes into this. And so it's just, it takes a long time. And in fact, it's so tremendous that a judge doesn't have the capacity to take on the case. So they appoint a special master, which is a special sort of judge who is like, all they're going to do is learn about this case. And so we have a special master in the LCR adjudication. And again, the LCR adjudication is the only live adjudication that's happening in the Colorado River Basin in Arizona. The upper basin outside of the LCR basin is not being adjudicated at this time. And the upper basin in Arizona is not being adjudicated at this time. In order for those adjudications to move forward, there would have to be a claim filed. And so, that, as you can see, it could take 50 years to get to the point where we are now in the LCR adjudication, where we've actually had trials. Hopi presented their claim in trial recently. In April of last year, we presented our claim in a trial that lasted until early August. And that's one trial. I think that this is actually the longest trial in the state of Arizona so far. In any event, that trial is going to move forward. There's going to be an outcome and a determination by the judge as to who gets rights to what amount of water in the LCR basin. And meanwhile, there is not anything moving on the upper basin or the lower basin outside of the LCR basin. So that's something really important to keep in mind when we talk about the settlement, because the settlement addresses all three basins, and it will open up a pathway for the Navajo people to have access to tremendous amounts, to almost all of the upper basin water in Arizona, 90% of the upper basin water in Arizona. And that is water that's available right on the Colorado River. And as I walk through that priority system, it's water that's taken off of the top. Before anybody else gets served in the Colorado River system, the state of Arizona gets its 50,000 acre feet. And in the upper basin, and then the other upper basin states get their percentages, and then that water flows down to the lower basin, and the rest of people in Arizona get access to the water. That's a little bit of an overstatement, because there are communities in Arizona outside of the Navajo Nation that get served from the upper basin water, and that is specifically the city of Page, and then there are some federal entities that get small amounts, But in any event, the settlement offers us 90% of the upper basin water, which is the firmest water in the Colorado River system. So that is very, very meaningful, and to me is one of the prime benefits of this settlement, because there is no active adjudication relating to Arizona's upper basin water. And we would have to wait at least 50 years in order to be at the point where we could actually have a trial relating to that claim, and even longer to have real meaningful access to that water. Whereas with the settlement, if we get this settlement done on the timeline we're hoping for, we could have a settlement by the end of the year. the calendar year. And that could mean us actually utilizing those upper basin water rights very, very soon. Certainly much sooner than 50 years. So very, very exciting. In any event, I mentioned that Hopi did their trial. We were joined by Michelle Espino. Many of you saw, Assistant Attorney General for the Water Rights Unit. And so, Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about the Hopi claim?
Yes, sure. Michelle Espino, Yinchia, Tachi Ninchla, Anathana Bashichin, Senajini Dashiche, Anathana Dashanala. And I am originally from Torreon chapter. I also, my Che is from the Clegato chapter. And so in regards to the Hopi decision, the special master did release her recommendation in 2022. And unfortunately, the special master made the recommendation of 29,000 acre feet a year of lower basin water in the Little Colorado River subbasin for the Hopi tribe. And the Hopi, their water claims were actually amounted to 90,000 acre feet a year for their water claim. And so you'll see that the special master only made a recommendation of about 1/3 of what Hopi was asking for. And so could we go ahead and go to the next slide? So this is a breakdown of the Hopi tribe's water claims, and on the first column on the left, it shows what their claim was for. So, for example, the first one is DCMI, which is domestic, commercial, municipal, and industrial. Basically for domestic purposes and also for like economic development. And so their claim was 9,322 acre feet a year. And you'll see that their claim is in the middle column. And then on the right side is the recommended decree from the special master. And it's about 1/3 of their claim. So this is the chart that is also available on the Navajo Water Rights Commission website. All of our presentations are available there. So if you want to see more detail, this is the chart to look to. So next slide. So this is a picture of our Navajo leadership, including President Nygren and Attorney General Branch, and many of our delegates who have been very active, not only by attending our litigation, our trial, but also being very involved in the settlement negotiations. And so this is the first day of our trial that took place in Phoenix last summer and lasted about 4 months long. Next slide. So this is the breakdown of our adjudication in the Lower Colorado River. We completed phase 1 trial, that is. However, we still had remaining the closing arguments. They were to be held in April. However, because of where we were at the time in the settlement agreement, we did request a continuance, and that was granted by the special master. If we were to move forward, not having a settlement, then we would have our phase 2 trial that would not have begun until September of 2027, and that probably would have ended either at the end of that year or maybe even gone into 2028. So phase 1, our claims that this part of the trial was focused on was domestic, commercial, municipal, light industrial, and stock and wildlife watering. And then phase 2 would have addressed their cultural, unique tribal, recreational, fish, wildlife conservation, mining, heavy industrial, commercial, and irrigation uses. And as the AG had alluded to, litigation takes a long time. And so even though we would have had our phase 2 trial in 2027, we probably wouldn't get a recommended decree for both phases until probably 2029. And then after that, there's a time where the parties have the opportunity to oppose the recommended decree. And then the court would make a decision on the recommended decree, and then it's opened up to appeals again. So we're talking about at least another decade, maybe more, before we would get a final decision in our Little Colorado River adjudication. Next slide. So, state of the Colorado River. You may be hearing in the news, a lot of discussion about the Colorado River and the current conditions of our water supply, and the fact that we are currently in what is being called a mega drought. And you all know that Lake Powell and Lake Mead have reduced greatly as a result of the hydrological conditions. And so this chart here shows that our water demand is growing and our water supply is going down. So this is something that's really important that we had to consider in our decisions to start negotiating a settlement. And it also impacts our litigation, whether we were going to go into a settlement or not. So this is the Colorado River and where it's at, its hydrological conditions is very concerning to all of the basin states and all of the tribes within the Colorado River Basin as well. So if we could go down to the next slide. Okay, settlement elements. So this is the list of all of the parties that we've been negotiating with for the past few months in a very small room. But we have a representation from each of these parties: the Navajo Nation, the Hopi Tribe, the San Juan Southern Paiute, the Department of Interior, who is acting as trustee on behalf of the tribes and allottees, the state of Arizona, the Arizona Department of Water Resources on behalf of the state of Arizona, and then we also have the Arizona State Land Department, Salt River Project, City of Flagstaff, and then the LCR Coalition, which is made up of 9 towns and ranches and other small municipalities in the Northeastern area. And, we also had representation from the governor's office, Governor Hobbs' office, in our negotiations. They stayed apprised of what was happening and also were present from time to time and really wanted to make sure that, their policies were being followed. And, they really did show that they want to support this settlement agreement. And so we did see that support from the governor's office. Next slide. And here's a picture of that small room I talked about. And you'll see some of our representatives there, former Attorney General Louis Dinetzosi, our litigation counsel, and then some of the other parties as well. And we worked about, I'd say, at least 3 days a week in the room. And then, of course, we continued working outside of the room as well on this very important settlement agreement. Next slide. And this is the map.
Well, I'm going to try to speed us through this section really quickly because I know we have an hour. And we did get started a little late. Apologies, little technological challenges here. Okay, so as Michelle was saying, this is a map of the nation's water claims in the state of Arizona, just to re-ground everyone again. Next slide, thank you. These are the various water sources that we're talking about. Again, it's comprehensive settlement in the state of Arizona. And we'll make this slide deck available on the DOJ website. So I'm not going to walk through every single little one of them, but you can see there's a bunch of surface water sources. There's groundwater sources, primarily in the sea aquifer and then in aquifer. And then, of course, our big Boquillas Ranch rights in the Gila River Basin. Next slide. Okay, so what did we settle for? Not a lot has changed from when we gave you guys a summary of the settlement negotiations the last time. We've just really refined some of the details of the agreement. And so here, again, we're still looking at 44,700 acre feet per year from the upper basin. Again, that's 90% of Arizona's allocation. Next slide. For the main stem lower basin, we're looking at 3,500 acre feet per year of the fourth priority lower basin Colorado River water, and 100 acre feet per year of the Hopi Cibola. Oh, now I'm adopting Michelle's pronunciation. Cibola lower basin water. And so just the Cibola water is also fourth priority, and a lot of Indian nations in the state of Arizona have settled using the CAP NIA water, the non-Indian agriculture water. And so, you know, what is interesting is that now those tribes are facing the possibility that that water is just not going to be there. So there's a lot of interesting things on the horizon in terms of even settled water rights in the state of Arizona. But we were fortunate that we were given fourth priority water. And so that is the way the priority system works in Arizona in the lower basin is that there are various priorities of users. So when there's a shortage of water in the lower basin, the ones who are lower priority get their water supply cut first. And we're talking like 1 through 6, and then the CAP NIA priority. So being in the fourth priority, there's still other users that are lower priority than we are in this system. So it's very useful to have that fourth priority water and have some level of security that our water needs will be served before others in the state. So next slide. Little Colorado River. So here, this is mostly surface water, and we would be settling for all of the LCR surface water that reaches the nation. And that is on average over a 10-year period, according to USGS data, that's the United States Geological Services data. That's about 122,000 acre feet per year. And that water is very heavily silted, so it's not economical to process that and utilize that as municipal water supply. So typically, that if we're using it at all, it's for irrigation purposes. And in fact, we did in the settlement preserve our right. We preserved our ability to make a call or ensure delivery of water for historic irrigation purposes up to the amount that we have proven in historic irrigation purposes. And then, of course, the right to all the water in the river includes all the water to the tributary water that reaches the nation. And then the existing users are grandfathered. And unfortunately, with the hydrological conditions along the LCR, it's often the case that water that makes it to Holbrook, well, it's often the case that there isn't water that makes it to Holbrook and then eventually makes it down because there are so many users upstream, and then additionally just the climate change conditions that and the evaporation levels. So really we're looking at water fed from the three canyons. And that's the 122, primarily the 122 acre feet per year, and then flood flows as well. Next slide. For the Navajo aquifer, it underlies the Hopi Nation and the Navajo Nation entirely. There's nothing outside of those. It doesn't extend beyond those two nations. So this is really, really important when you compare it to the litigation, because in the litigation, we and Hopi are kind of making our case for how much of that water we have a right to. And then there's sort of the question of like, who gets what remains, what didn't get divvied up among the tribes. In the settlement context, there's no question that all of the water in the aquifer goes to either Hopi Nation or Navajo Nation. And in fact, what we agreed to is something that would be sustainable. We both have an interest for spiritual purposes and otherwise to go ahead and bring back the springs and really recharge the aquifer. And so we've imposed upon ourselves pumping limitations. So for Navajo Nation, that's 8,400 acre feet per year. And then for For Navajo Nation, it's 8,400 acre feet per year, and for Hopi tribe, it's 5,600 acre feet. And then both tribes have the ability to utilize up to 2,000 acre feet per year for industrial purposes. But given the heavy industrial pumping that has happened on the aquifer, both nations were sensitive to heavy industrial use, and so they wanted to put that cap on industrial uses. So there's nothing that requires us to use those 2,000 acre feet for industrial purposes. It's just protecting the use of the rest of that water for municipal purposes and other purposes. So next slide. And then, of course, there's the Coconino Aquifer. You can see that's a tremendous aquifer that underlies the entire Four Corners area. And so the nation has the right there to all of the Coconino Aquifer that underlies the nation. And one of the prime pumping locations for high quality quantity as well as high quality water is actually my home chapter, Loop, Arizona, and is actually my backyard, East Canyon Diablo area. And so we did a lot in the settlement to protect that area. And it was very helpful for me, having ridden horses all over that area, and ridden my horse through the neighboring ranches, and to just know the geography of that area and the negotiations, and already know from running some livestock on some of those ranches where some of those wells are. So what we did was we built in buffer zones. Buffer zone 1, which we'll go into in more detail on the next slide, as well as buffer zone 2 and a well spacing configuration. Oh, sorry, can you take us back? And then there's a side agreement that relates to neighboring ranches or neighboring parties that have an interest in and the ability to pump in the region. And so we want to place caps on their ability to pump so that we could protect the wells on the nation and ensure that we would be able to continue using our existing wells and our prime pumping opportunities on the Coconino Aquifer for as long as possible. So next slide. Okay, here's buffer zone 1 and 2. Hopefully everyone can see this okay. And so the pink area is Navajo reservation land. And then you see that first line that extends south and west of our border. And that's a 2-section buffer. Each section's about a mile long, so it's about 2 miles of buffer. And then buffer zone 2 is below that. That's an additional 4 sections, so an additional 4 miles. So we have built in most cases, 6 miles of protection for our wells. And the way that works is you get the most protection, about 70% of protection from having a 2-mile buffer. And then you get really what we believe will be close to 100% protection with the 6-mile buffer. And so in buffer zone 1, the only new wells that can be drilled are limited to 35 gallons per minute. Those are basically stock wells. So nothing significant. And then in buffer zone 2, the limit is 500 gallons per minute. And so those are larger wells, but they're still, they're not massive wells. And we also have a well spacing configuration agreement with Arizona State Land Department. They own a lot of basically the checkerboard parcels in the section south of the nation and are in most cases Arizona State land. And there's some federal land. You can see the purple National Park Service land. That's Grand Canyon National Park up there. And so the buffer zones don't apply to National Park Service and some of the other users that we felt had more of a conservation based approach. But most other parties are covered by the buffer zones. Next slide. This is the Sea Aquifer pumping restriction area. We worked out I mentioned the site agreement. So with respect to Hopi tribe, they actually own a lot of ranch land just south of us, specifically at Hart Ranch. So we wanted to make sure that they weren't pumping tremendous amounts that could adversely impact our wells, that could result in reductions in quantity from our wells, or that could impair the quality of our wells. And so we worked out a 1 mile buffer zone with them. You can see Hopi Tribe Buffer North, and it looks kind of jagged because for the Arizona state land lease lands, I mentioned there's checkerboarding. So even though the ranch is contiguous, the parcels are, one parcel fee, one parcel state trust land. Some of it's leased, some of it's owned. And Hopi's in the process of condemning the state land and converting it into, I guess initially it would be fee land and then eventually trust land. And so, we have the 1 mile buffer, 1 mile plus buffer for Hopi tribe. So they can't drill any new wells above 35 gallons per minute in that zone. And you may be saying, but you just told me that the best protection comes from 2 miles of buffer zone. And that is true. 70% of the protections comes from the 2 mile buffer. But here's the thing. If you look at the map, I can't show you with my mouse, but we have pictures of where our wells are south of Loop, and all of them are more than 1 mile from our reservation boundary. So even with Hopi, we will have, in effect, factually speaking, we will have 2 mile buffer zones with them. And then south of their buffer north, it's Hopi Tribe Buffer South. And in that region, it'll have an aggregate cap, an overall cap on the amount of pumping that they can do. And that amount is it, Michelle, it's 6,750, 6,570. Something like that. I apologize. I don't have the number on the tip of my mind at the moment. But it's a meaningful cap. And we did a lot of modeling. These are not just numbers we pulled out of the air. We had hydrologists go and figure out, if they're pumping to the cap, will our wells still be protected? For how long will that be protected? We wanted to make sure we had at least 100-year protections. And then of course there's just sort of the facts on the ground, like how likely is it that Hopi's going to be pumping large amounts of water? We're not sure that we'll have the protection. Those 100-year protections will be in effect up until the point that they actually start pumping to the max of our agreement. So even though you may be thinking, well, 100 years isn't a long time, it may in fact, depending on when or if they ever pump up to that max, it could be 150 years, it could be 200 years. So that's important to keep in mind as well. Next slide. And we did have some special provisions relating to the Twin Arrows area. You can see the yellow line is the buffer, again, following the 1934 reservation boundary for the nation. We have 2 wells at Twin Arrows that are large wells, and we wanted to protect those water sources for our Twin Arrows investments. So we created a 3/4 mile buffer around those wells, and then we have a 1 mile buffer to our reservation north of the well protection areas. And then south of down to just a small bit of that section, just south of Twin Arrows, it was very important to Hopi tribe to have the ability to develop their fee land. Their fee land in the Twin Arrows region is the land that's outlined in the black line. So you can see they have fee parcels that are now in trust, actually. That land is just south of the Twin Arrows parking lot. And so we kind of, as part of a negotiation, right? And so we provide them some protections for their well. They built a bluebird well right in that corner. You can see the blue circle, semicircle line around it. So we gave them some protection there. And then we also, instead of having the 1 mile buffer on the north of Twin Arrows, we kind of compromised on giving them a 1 section buffer protection, not a full section. You can see that in the map. That gives them a little more space to do some development just south of the parking lot. So my boss is here wanting my attention. Okay, next slide. And then there's Barty Bar Ranch, which is right next to the Hopi Heart Ranch lands. So it's a little bit south of them. You can't see it so well, but if you're familiar with the Meteor Crater exit, the Barty Bar lands are, if you exit there, it's like everything south between Meteor City and Two Guns, everything south of I-40. And it's so funny to talk about this. These are places that I used to catch the bus to go to school. But the yellow hashed lines are Barty Bar Ranch lands. And that's where the restriction area is. And you can see it's checkerboarded because, again, the Arizona state land leased lands are the areas that don't have the restriction for Barty Bar Ranch. But of course, we have the separate agreement with Arizona state lands relating to aggregation methodology. And that basically just ensures well spacing. And so I won't go into that too much in detail because that's going to take a little while to explain, and we only have maybe 6 more minutes left on this presentation. And I do apologize that we had a late start and that we don't have a lot of time, but this afternoon I certainly am on my way to a public presentation here in Kayenta. We're trying to get as many public presentations in as we can in advance of Council's consideration of the water settlement for Arizona. And we're doing the same thing on the New Mexico side. Michelle was just in Through yesterday to present to that community and neighboring communities. So with Barty Bar Ranch, they have a pumping aggregate restriction of 4,000 acre feet per year in these yellow striped parcels. And then they have limitations in the red striped parcels as well to having smaller wells. So that gets you through our side deal. And then we were also negotiating with the city of Flagstaff, and we did not finalize our agreement with them. We unfortunately just weren't able to get that to a close on the timeline that we needed to be on. It doesn't mean that we won't end up with some kind of an agreement with them at some point. But this is where things are right at this point. And that is very, that's one of the differences between the settlement summary that we had been sharing with you guys in March and April and where we are today. So next slide. Okay, allotments are covered on reservation. Allotments for Navajo Nation are covered. They're going to be served. They are already being served by NTUA in many instances. And so they'll just continue to be served out of the nation's water rights. So next slide. Okay, key benefits of the settlement. So, obviously getting real water to our people. And a big part of that is the billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that are part of the settlement. And we're now getting to that point where we're going to talk about that a little bit more, what the projects are and the amount of funding associated with those projects. So that infrastructure is necessary. Once that infrastructure is in place, then there are going to be lots of different ways that we can intertie households to that master infrastructure. And the other great thing about the settlement, jumping ahead a little bit here on this slide, is that I'll just follow the order. It's really going to help us get to our plan, our long-term plan, Navajo Tribal Utility Authority's long-term plan for how to meet the needs of the Navajo Nation in the long term, like 100 years out, essentially. And that's a vision for a global water supply system. And that system will give us the security we need so that if there's ever any interruption in supply from one water source, they can pull from another water source and have that dynamic and flexible system moving water all different directions. And so one thing that's key that the settlement will give us that no litigation ever would give us is the ability to divert Arizona water in all 3 states. And so that would be New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona. And we already have infrastructure that's being built out in New Mexico as well as Utah as part of those settlements for the state of Utah, and then also the San Juan River in New Mexico. Many of you seen the Navajo Gallup water supply system. We want to be able to continue the build out of that system into Arizona and be able to bring water from basically the San Juan River and bring it all the way into Window Rock, as well as Lepton, Ganado, Greasewood. And then we also, want to be able to, I talked about redundancy and backup and security and the supply. So let's take Greasewood, for example. We want them to be able to get water both from the San Juan River in New Mexico through this distribution model. And we also want them to be able to get groundwater from Loop. And so, if we have to drill a new well in Loop, then we can shut off the line sourcing from the sea aquifer and just use the surface water from San Juan River. And vice versa, if there's a really dry year on the San Juan River, we're not getting the water that we needed or wanted in the system, then we can pull more water from the Coconino aquifer. So having that ability to divert from multiple states is super, super important to protecting our people and an uninterrupted supply to water and uninterrupted access to water. And then the other really key thing, again, that you will not get in any litigation, because this is not lawful under the law of the river right now. Pulling water from 3 states is not allowed under the law of the river right now. So we need Congress to authorize it. It's not lawful right now to move water from Lake Powell to Tuba City or Cameron because they're divided by the basin line. The city or the community of Litchie is part of the upper basin, but that's pretty much where that line ends. And then south of that, Tuba City and Cameron are not part of the upper basin. So under the law of the river and what we could get in litigation, you would not be able to move that upper basin water to Tuba City or Cameron, even if, despite the compelling situation of having so many people in the lower basin who need that Navajo water, who are also Navajo. The law of the river just, it would not accommodate our needs. And so we really need Congress to grant that authorization and that flexibility that the nation needs in order to operate its dynamic, flexible system and have the initial supply for Tuba City coming from Lake Powell, and then also to have the flexibility to use backup supplies. And for example, once we build the pipeline to Cameron, it's going to be easier for the nation to use its own money to run that line all the way down to Loop, bring water to Black Falls and Grand Falls and Loop, so that if there's ever any interruption in the sea aquifer supply, then we can be bringing in Colorado River surface water from the upper basin. So that's, another reason why the settlement is so important. And this is something that only the settlement can offer again. And then I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Michelle, and I'm going to have Michelle close us out because I actually need to get to my presentation here in Kayenta. So Michelle, we really didn't get through the projects. So maybe we need to have a part 2 on Monday where we really go through the projects.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Thank you so much, AG. You did a great job as usual. So, safe travels.
Okay.
Okay, next slide, or are we, I think we probably met our time. So thank you very much for joining us. And we will do a part 2 so that we can go over the projects that are part of the settlement. Again, we do have to have the settlement approved by Congress and the funding approved by Congress. So your support, your help, your prayers are very much appreciated so that we can get this approved and funded by Congress. But we do have quite a few projects that are included in the settlement. The price tag for the settlement agreement is $5 billion, and that'll bring us the much needed water infrastructure to the Navajo Nation that we've never had and very much need. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you hopefully on Monday for part 2.